Hi, everybody. This is Steve Sabludowsky, publisher of BayouBuzz.com. And believe it or not, we're doing a Facebook Live with Leo Honeycutt, wherever he is. He's coming. The author, Leo Honeycutt, and Jim Brown. Jim, I'm going to go and post this right now to your page, to Leo's page, and then if y'all would share it from your Facebook page. Why don't you take it over, Jim?
Well, for those who are just tuning in to us, Steve and I regularly do this Facebook chat where we talk about some of the current issues involving both Louisiana as well as the nation and how Louisiana ties into what's happening in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of apprehension from our state. Off the air before we started coming on, Leo Honeycutt and Steve and I talked at length about what it used to be when seniority was really a key element to getting anything done, the power in Washington, what committees you were on, and bringing home the bacon, if you will, whether you think that should be done or not. It's been an important component in Washington. If you live in Louisiana, you go back into the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, and you had these icons in Washington that were Mr. Chairman, whether it be Hale Boggs, the majority leader in the Congress, whether it be Russell Long, chairman of the Finance Committee, the most powerful committee in the Senate. Bennett Johnson headed up the oil and gas activities there for years. Alan Elder before him was a very powerful senator. And we can go right down the line. Otto Passman in the 5th District, Joe Wagner in the 4th District, right down the line, Jimmy Morrison in the Baton Rouge area, a few folks in Baton Rouge, all were powerful legislators with years of seniority. We don't have that anymore. Our seniority is one of the least amounts in terms of overall experience of any state in the country. And so the question we're going to explore a little bit today, not too long, is what is Louisiana's strengths in terms of Washington? And so, Leo, you remember the good old days. Leo was up in Monroe with KNOE, the major station up that way in the old days. And gosh, Otto Passman walked on water when Russell Long came to North Louisiana. People genuflected. It was quite a different time today, wasn't it, Leo?
Absolutely.
Jim, why don't you introduce Leo? I do apologize. People don't know what he's written, so why don't you, if you don't mind, why don't you just do that?
Let me stand up. Leo has written a number of major books in the state. Probably his best known is the book about Edwin Edwards, governor of Louisiana, probably the largest selling book by a Louisiana author in the history of the state. Leo's written about Jerry Lane, the great largest car dealer in the Deep South, Clark Williams, you folks up in Monroe, the icon who founded CenturyLink, the 3rd largest telephone operation in America. And Leo's been their biographer and has written extensively, also written novels. Right now, we're writing a book about Skip Bertman, the icon of athletic directors in this country from LSU. So Leo's quite a writer, TV personality, and we're glad to have you join us here today, Leo.
Well, thank you very much. And I've been honored to be around a lot of great people and to write about a lot of great people at great times. I was just stopped by a firefighter the other day, and he said, I was going to make a point not to buy the Edwards book. But he said, I sat in a bookstore for about 4 hours reading the thing one day, and finally the store owner came up and said, "Hey, look, pal, this ain't a library. You need to go ahead and buy the book." So he said, I read it 5 times, and everybody in the firehouse has read it at least once. He said, you know what that book really is a biography of the state, because I remember when all those things happened. And he said, it really is kind of puts my life in a chronological order. So I was very, very humbled by that, very honored to do it. But yes, it did bring up so much research about the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and truly how powerful Louisiana's delegation was. With Russell Long sitting at the head of the Senate Finance Committee, presidents were calling him to find out if they could float up tax breaks or tax hikes. So, of course, that was Huey's son. And I remember that one of the last interviews I got to do with Russell Long, in fact, I think it was the last interview, not too long before he died, he said that he was very proud of the fact that he had helped write the code, the tax code for this country, somewhat based on the share the wealth societies and principles that his father had come up with, where there was sort of, as we call it today, the trickle down effect, that it was a share of the wealth from those who made a lot of money down in the ranks of the middle class and then the bottom. And he said, I'm really kind of proud of that. I like that. And I like the fact that we in this country, while we're not a socialist country, he said, I like the fact that we can spread this money around so that that is the economic generator. So, I mean, that's about as powerful as it gets.
No doubt about it. Well, and I think the key is, like I say, these chairmen, virtually every Louisiana congressman was a chairman, by a stroke of the pen or a nod or a quick call to the aide, could get so many things done. And as you said, they didn't call the president trying to get an audience. The president called them regularly. And it's a far cry. I'm sure, I'm not going to mention the name of our congressman. There's a congressman in Louisiana who knew that my son-in-law is very close to the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. And he said, next time you see Paul Ryan, would you tell him that I'm a Louisiana congressman? So I don't think he knows who I am, and I'd like to let him know that we're friends and that so he knows who I am. So on the other hand, I guess Steve, and you might have some thoughts on this too. I'm not sure that we don't have the numbers. We can talk about individual members of Congress. Scalise now, and not, in fact, we've lost two members that had a little seniority, and Congressman Busani in South Louisiana, Congressman Fleming up in Northwest Louisiana. So we don't have the numbers now anymore. But if you look at the legislators going to Washington, particularly in the Senate, they don't wait around and wait for seniority. You know, Ted Cruz ran a pretty good race for president. He was pretty much the number 2 guy in the Republican Party, and he'd been in the Senate for 2 years. Barack Obama had been in the Senate for 2 years, ran and was elected president of this country. Marco Rubio had been there, I think, 3 years, Steve, and he ran a fairly decent race for president. So the new people that go up don't wait around and bow to Mr. Chairman. They go ahead and make their mark in an ancillary way. And I think that reflects the view of Donald Trump. Look, we're not going to do things like we used to do it. We're going to shake up the system. So maybe there's grounds for a new senator, we're going to have a new senator here in about 1 week. And we're going to have, we've got a new senator in Bill Cassidy. If they're got the gumption and they want to go fight enough, maybe they can cut their own niche and be a pretty good spokesman for Louisiana. That's just my thoughts. And it's different than what it was 20 years ago is the point I'm making.
If I could interject, and by the way, if you could go to your Facebook pages, I posted the link, and so please share them, okay? Yeah, so, yeah, it's really amazing. The question is, and we're talking about term limits, and I mean, what, term limits, David Vitter brought that, and now he's leaving. It's kind of ironic. That Donald Trump now, the last couple of weeks of the campaign, said that he wants term limits. You know, the question I have is, you know, how important is experience? I personally think experience is incredibly important. You know, I don't agree with everybody who says that you know, we need new blood. We need to drain the swamp every election, it seems. I think experience really matters. I think having, you know, the people in there who know the system, you know, really matters. I mean, you know, now y'all know the legislative system. Talk about Louisiana. I mean, do you think that we should just be throwing the bums out all the time? I mean, is term limits working?
And by the way, people have been feeling that way ever since the genesis of this country. On election day for this presidential election, I was in Williamsburg, Virginia. I went back and studied the genesis of what the United States and the Constitution are about, going all the way back to the House of Burgesses. And it's interesting when you read through the writings of the law professor of what is now William and Mary, for Thomas Jefferson, you really see where Jefferson got so many of his ideas for not just the Declaration, but also the Constitution. And then you go forward after the Revolution and up to the Continental Congress of 1789, and you see the very first set that they ratified the Constitution, the very first set of amendments, the very first set, Thomas Jefferson floated up an amendment that said that Congress could not vote itself a raise. Now, understand that there were congressmen served at their own expenses back then. They weren't given an expense account, and they certainly weren't given a salary. But he said someday the day will come when they will be, and he did not want them to be career politicians. That amendment was struck. It never made it.
Well, I think back to Steve's point, look, I think seniority does make a difference, although this is not a popular thing to the average person. They don't really see the results of this. But, America is so big and there's such varying alliances, our positions on Israel, for example, versus the Arab world. And you have some very competent senators like John McCain from Arizona, Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, Sherrod Brown from Ohio, all have been active in the Foreign Affairs Committee and have developed relationships with leadership all over the world. So the president can only do so much. You got a president, we're going to have a secretary of state, but in this big world, it's a lot to expect them to be able to deal with all these different countries, and experience helps along that regard. When it comes to understanding the budget, it shouldn't be that complicated, but it's awfully complicated, as is the tax code. So Steve, I agree with you that experience makes a difference. I'm just saying in this day and age where 20 years ago, experience was something that got you reelected. Don't give up all the relationships I have. Today, throw the bums out. I've seen flags in the fall, fire them all. And so there's a Trump feeling that we're going to shake up the system. As you said, not just the lobbyists, but the older establishment people in Washington have not served the country well. And so I just in watching the national campaign, I didn't see anybody talk about experience. I said that they were, even the guys been there 25 years were saying, we got to change the culture in Washington. Well, they're the culture. As I've told Leo, I've told Steve this before. I said, when you're running against Washington to get elected, it's a cesspool. But once you get up there, it becomes a hot tub.
Hot tub.
As a consequence, so yes, seniority is important. It's something that we benefited from greatly in Louisiana. But I don't think you get elected talking about how long you've served and all the seniority you have.
If I can add something, about what Russell Long said, one of the last things he did say in one of those interviews to me was that he was really, truly worried for the country, because he said campaigns had become so expensive, so grossly unfair to people who didn't have money or access to money to even be able to run, that the common person really couldn't run for Congress. And he was afraid that Congress had become an elitist society. And when you look at how they voted in the last 25 or 30 years to vote themselves a separate retirement, separate health care, but yet they run up the flag all kinds of policies on public retirement and public health care, of which they're not part of, then of course people are tired of that. People hear these stories, and when you try to get answers, you don't really get clear answers. So I can see why Donald Trump would have been elected, because people were ready to shake up things. Now, I can argue both points about term limits and also about trying to maintain, people who have had experience, because they can not shortcut the system, but they can get so much more done because they know how it works. But inevitably, because there is so much money involved, and because the lobbying efforts are so entrenched now, that's the problem. I think people want to throw out the bums, like they say, because they think the fresh faces coming in are like Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Well, but it's just like Jim just said, the cesspool then becomes a hot tub. And so, there you go. They might come back to their district. And I've actually seen congressmen change. I've seen them be idealistic. And when they come back, you can look in their eye and you can tell, yep, they're in the hot tub.
So would Edwin Edwards, obviously, he was in office when there wasn't any term limits. Can you just imagine if he had term limits?
Well, of course, he was governor for 4 terms, which is a record. And I'm not even sure that there's anybody in the country that's had more than 4 terms. But in his particular instance, when he represented the 7th Congressional District down in Crowley and Jennings, down in the southwest part of the state, at that time, and now, the rice growing regions in Louisiana cut a diagonal from northeast Louisiana down to southwest Louisiana. So he teamed up with 5th District Congressman Otto Passman. This was in 68, 69. And they realized that Tongsun Park, who was from South Korea, really was trying to ingratiate himself with the Congress because Tongsun Park was afraid that the U.S. was going to pull its air bases out of South Korea, then North Korea would invade. So he came in and tried and really wooed the congressional delegation. Well, Edwards and Passman immediately saw, wait a minute, they buy all their rice from California, it ships out of California, and they don't buy any Louisiana rice. So they reversed it on him, and they got him to agree to with the president of South Korea to buy $40 million of Louisiana rice, exclusively Louisiana rice, the biggest rice deal in history. And it wound up being a huge boon for the Louisiana economy back in the 1970s. But then, of course, the FBI started the investigation into how Tongsun Park was making these payoffs. Edwards becomes this poster child for the Tongsun Park affair, when in reality, it didn't take any time at all for the investigators to figure out that he really hadn't done anything wrong, as had Otto Passman, who was acquitted in a trial. And the only congressman who actually went to jail for that whole thing, and there were like 44 congressmen who were compromised, the only one who went to jail was from California, who lost the rice deal.
Get the rice deal. Steve, could I jump back to what you had said?
Yeah.
Though? And I don't want to be a big defender of those, as Leo did, talked about how these guys line their pockets and everything. The only thing I'd say about that is that depending on your background, you can make a heck of a sacrifice. And I'll give you my own personal example. I was an elected official in Louisiana for 28 years. I started off as a statewide official making $37,000 a year in the 80s. Today, that would probably be worth $80,000, $85,000, $90,000, let's say $90,000. But look, I was a lawyer. I've got an education. I've got a degree from Cambridge University in England. I've got a law degree from Tulane. I think I'm capable, and I passed up the opportunity of making a heck of a lot more money than $75,000 or $80,000 a year. When I left the job as Secretary of State, my salary was $85,000 a year, where my colleagues who graduated from Tulane with me were making 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times that amount of money. So, Leo, when it comes to the perks and the retirement and that kind of thing, I'm not quite as blistering if someone has served and gives himself to public life. And people, those guys are on the take and they get all these benefits. Let me tell you what, I gave up Saturdays and Sundays going to fairs and festivals and gatherings and speaking, and probably missed too many recitals of my kids. And I think I made a heck of a lot of sacrifices. And quite frankly, if you would look me in the eyes of Jim Brown, tell us whether it was worth it or not. Would you go back and run again? I'm not sure I would, because of all I gave up to be an elected official. So you give up a lot, and you ought to get some compensation for it. And these cabinet members coming in, when they make $185,000 a year, giving up a lot of money. So you got to balance all that off, is the point I'm trying to make, Steve.